In a small-town diner, George Walker, a 78-year-old retired Navy sailor, is mocked by young waiter Kyle for his scarred hands. Unbeknownst to Kyle, those scars are from a heroic act decades ago, saving 12 crewmates from a fire aboard the USS Oriskany. As Kyle's teasing peaks, the diner's atmosphere shifts when four Navy officers, led by Chief James Allen, arrive to honor George. Their entrance silences the room, leaving Kyle stunned and the crowd in awe. What happens next will reveal George's past and teach Kyle a lesson in respect that he'll never forget. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to join us in celebrating everyday heroes. Share your own stories of quiet courage in the comments. Let's honor those who inspire us with their resilience and wisdom. Thank you for supporting our channel. In the dim glow of the small-town diner, George Walker sat tucked away in his usual corner booth, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he cradled a steaming cup of black coffee. At 78, his frame carried the weight of years, slightly stooped under a faded cap that barely contained his thinning white hair. His heavy coat, pulled tight against the evening chill, seemed to shield more than just his body from the cold. It was as if it held together the fragments of a life few in the diner could imagine. To the strangers bustling past the diner's fogged-up windows, George was just another old man, unremarkable, blending into the background of a world that moved too fast to notice him. But his hands, scarred and rough, told a story etched deeper than the lines on his face. Those scars weren't the kind born of careless mishaps or kitchen blunders. They were thick, pale ridges against his sun-worn skin, remnants of a fire so ferocious it had devoured steel and swallowed entire decks aboard the USS Oriskany decades ago. In that inferno, a young George had charged headlong into the flames, dragging 12 crewmates to safety, his own hands blistering and burning as he refused to abandon a single soul. That bravery, that sacrifice lingered in his silence now, unspoken, buried beneath the weight of years. George lived alone now in a modest apartment just a few blocks from the diner. No family waited for him there. No children's voices broke the quiet of his evenings with phone calls or visits. His medals, his commendations, proof of a heroism most would never know, sat untouched in a dusty shoebox on a closet shelf, their shine dulled by time and neglect. George wasn't one to boast. To him, what mattered was that he'd done what was right, that his brothers in uniform had lived to tell their own stories. That was enough. Each evening, like clockwork, he made his way to this diner, claiming his corner booth by the window. The black coffee he ordered was more than a drink. It was a ritual, a tether to the simple, steady rhythm of life. He'd sit there watching the world pass by outside, savoring the warmth of the cup in his hands and the fleeting peace of a moment unhurried by the chaos of youth or ambition. To the diner's regulars, George was a fixture, as familiar as the flickering neon sign outside or the cracked leather booths within. The old-timers like Miguel, the cook who'd been flipping burgers there for years, knew fragments of George's story. They'd caught whispers of it through hushed conversations, seen it in the quiet respect of the older patrons who'd nod to George as they passed. Miguel noticed the way George folded his napkin with precision, as if that small act of care anchored him in a world that often felt unsteady. He saw the way George's eyes would sometimes drift to the door, a flicker of longing in them, as if he were waiting for someone who'd never come. And he respected the way George never raised his voice, not even when the world gave him every reason to. But not everyone saw George that way. Kyle, the new waiter, was young, restless, and carried a sharp edge of confidence that bordered on arrogance. To him, George was just an old man with shaky hands and a thin wallet, someone easy to overlook, easy to tease, easy to dismiss. Kyle didn't know the weight of the scars on George's hands, didn't know the fire they'd survived or the lives they'd saved. To him, George was a tired figure, a relic of a time he couldn't be bothered to understand. Each night, as George sat quietly in his booth, Kyle's smirks and quick jabs became bolder, his laughter a little louder, his mockery a little sharper. The old-timers noticed, their faces tightening with disapproval, but Kyle was oblivious, too caught up in his own amusement to see the history sitting just feet away. That night, as George stirred the last bit of sugar into his coffee, his hands moved with a deliberate care, as if each motion was a small act of defiance against the tremors that betrayed his age. Kyle leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his grin wide and boyish, tinged with a mischief that hadn't yet learned restraint. He watched George with a glint in his eye, as if the old man's quiet presence was an invitation for ridicule. George, unaware of the attention at first, folded his napkin with the same meticulous care he always did, smoothing its edges as though the act brought him a quiet comfort, a fleeting sense of control in a world that often felt out of his grasp. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a wallet so worn its leather edges had softened to the touch of time. Slowly he counted out the bills, aligning them neatly on the check, his scarred fingers moving with a precision that spoke of a life lived with purpose. A small folded dollar tip joined the exact change, a modest gesture, but one that carried the weight of his dignity. Kyle sauntered over, a rag in hand, pretending to wipe down the table next to George's booth. As he passed, his foot shifted, brushing against George's boot, not hard, but enough to jolt the old man's balance as he reached for his cane. "Oops," Kyle said, his voice light but laced with a smirk he didn't bother to hide. "Careful there, Grandpa." The word dripped with condescension, and a soft ripple of laughter came from a nearby table, where a few younger patrons had been watching the exchange. George's hand gripped the edge of the table for a moment, steadying himself, and his eyes lifted to meet Kyle's. For a brief second, something flickered in his gaze, something quiet, tired, but unmistakably resolute, like the embers of a fire that had never fully gone out. He gave a faint shake of his head, as if dismissing the boy's antics as unworthy of his anger, and turned back to his check. The diner grew quiet for a moment, the air heavy with unspoken tension. A middle-aged man at a nearby table shook his head, muttering something under his breath, his frustration with Kyle's behavior simmering just below the surface. A young woman glanced uneasily at her friend, their eyes meeting briefly before they looked away, unwilling to get involved. Kyle, oblivious to the shift in the room, turned back toward the counter, his grin unfazed. George, meanwhile, gathered himself, pushing up from the booth with a slow, deliberate grace. His cane tapped softly against the floor as he moved toward the door, each step steady despite the weight of years and the sting of Kyle's words. "Yeah, walk away, Grandpa," Kyle called after him, his voice light but sharp, cutting through the hum of the diner. A few muffled laughs followed, but they were quickly swallowed by the clink of dishes and the low murmur of conversation. George didn't turn back. His shoulders, though stooped, carried a quiet strength as he pushed open the door and stepped into the evening chill. Inside, Kyle leaned back against the counter, unaware that the night was far from over. In just 2 hours, the diner's doors would swing open again, and 4 U.S. Navy officers would step inside, their presence commanding the room into silence. And in that moment, Kyle would learn the weight of his words, the depth of the man he'd dismissed, and the unshakable legacy of a hero who'd never sought recognition, but whose past was about to walk right through the front door. From the corner booth, a group of teenagers huddled, their voices a mix of whispers and stifled laughter, as if unsure whether to join the lively hum of the diner or retreat into their own world. Their uncertainty hung in the air, a fleeting moment of youth caught between belonging and detachment. Outside, the night wrapped George Walker in a gentle chill, the kind that seeps into your bones and stirs memories long buried. He tugged his worn coat tighter around his shoulders, the fabric heavy with time and use, and shuffled toward the wooden bench just beyond the diner's glowing window. The bench groaned under his weight, its weathered slats creaking as he settled down, his gnarled hands folding over the smooth curve of his cane. For a long while he simply sat, his breath slow and steady, his eyes tracing the quiet street where headlights drifted past like fireflies in a dream. Each passing car seemed to carry a piece of the world he no longer fully belonged to, their beams cutting through the darkness like slow-moving stars. George's thoughts wandered, not to any one moment, but to a lifetime of them. Fragmented images of waves crashing against a ship's hull, the laughter of men who'd become brothers, and the weight of choices made in the chaos of youth. He didn't dwell on regret, but there was a quiet ache in his chest, a longing for something he couldn't name. Inside the diner, the air buzzed with life. Kyle, the young waiter with a grin that never seemed to fade, tossed a rag over his shoulder with a flourish, his voice carrying over the clatter of plates as he recounted a story to a coworker. His laughter was bright, infectious, the kind that made you feel the world was lighter than it was. He moved with the restless energy of someone thriving in the chaos of a busy night, his pride in handling the rush evident in every quick step. But behind the kitchen window, Miguel stood apart, his mood a stark contrast to the diner's warmth. His hands, rough from years of work, wiped slowly on his apron, the motion almost mechanical as his jaw tightened. His dark eyes flicked toward the old man outside, alone on the bench, a solitary figure framed against the night. Miguel's heart stirred with something heavy, recognition perhaps, or a sense of duty that ran deeper than the routine of his shift. He'd seen George night after night, always at the same table, always with the same quiet demeanor. But tonight felt different. There was a weight to the moment, an unspoken urgency that tugged at him. His fingers, almost of their own accord, reached for the phone in his pocket. He knew this wasn't just another night, not for George, not for the man on the other end of the line he was about to call. Miguel slipped through the swinging door into the kitchen, the noise of the diner fading behind him like a tide pulling back from the shore. The clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversation, and Kyle's carefree laughter softened into a distant murmur. Leaning against the counter, the cool edge pressing into his palms, Miguel pulled out his phone. His fingers hesitated over the screen, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind, not about what he was doing, but about whether he was ready for what might follow. He scrolled to the contact labeled Chief Allen, his thumb hovering for a heartbeat before pressing the call button. The phone rang once, sharp and clear, before a deep voice answered, steady but laced with an undercurrent of anticipation. "Miguel," the voice said, not a question, but a confirmation, as if Chief Allen had been waiting for this moment. "It's him," Miguel said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes drifting to the small kitchen window where George's silhouette sat etched against the night. "He's here, sitting outside the diner right now." There was a pause on the other end, not of hesitation, but of a man catching his breath, as if the weight of years had suddenly shifted. "Are you sure?" Chief Allen's voice was calm, controlled, but beneath it ran a current of urgency, a flicker of emotion he'd spent decades learning to temper. Miguel's gaze lingered on George, the old man's shoulders slightly hunched, his face half lit by the diner's glow. "I'm sure," he replied, his voice steady now. "He comes here every night. But tonight, you should come, you all should." On the other end, the faint scrape of a chair echoed, followed by Allen's voice, firm and resolute. "Thank you, son. Tonight's the night." The call ended with a soft click, and Miguel lowered the phone, his chest rising and falling with a slow exhale. He tucked the device back into his pocket, his hands pressing against the counter as if grounding himself. For a moment, he stood still, his eyes fixed on George's quiet figure outside. A man who seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime in his stillness. Then, with a deep breath, Miguel stepped back into the rhythm of the kitchen, the sounds of the diner folding around him once more. But they felt different now, muted, as if the night itself had tilted on its axis, charged with a purpose he could feel but not yet name. Miles away, in a small home lined with memories of a life at sea, Chief James Allen stood from his desk, the phone still warm in his hand. A man in his 60s, his movements carried the precision of someone who'd spent decades in uniform, each step deliberate, each gesture measured. He set the phone down with care, his fingers brushing over a faded black and white photograph on his bookshelf. A frozen moment of young sailors aboard the USS Oriskany, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, their faces alight with the reckless joy of youth. His eyes lingered on the man in the center, a younger George Walker, his smile untouched by the decades that would follow, unaware of the storms, both literal and otherwise, that lay ahead. Allen's heart tightened, not with sadness, but with a fierce, unspoken resolve. He'd made a promise long ago, one that time had not eroded. "Boys, suit up," he called, his voice cutting through the quiet of the house with the authority of a man who'd never stopped leading. "We found him. Tonight's the night." In the next room, three men stirred, their conversations falling silent as they caught the edge in Allen's tone. They were older now, their faces etched with lines earned through years of service, their hair streaked with gray. But as they rose from their chairs, there was a spark in their movements, a lightness that spoke of shared history, of battles fought together, and of a loyalty that time could not dull. They moved with purpose, their hands reaching for jackets and keys, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. Alan crossed to his bedroom, where his uniform lay neatly across the bed, the fabric crisp despite its age. He pinned his medals with practiced care, his fingers steady as they smoothed the fabric, each motion a ritual of respect. From a small wooden box on the dresser, he retrieved a velvet case, its hinges worn from years of waiting, its contents a symbol of a debt long owed. There was no hesitation in his eyes, only clarity. Tonight wasn't about ceremony or grand gestures. It was about something deeper, something forged in the crucible of sacrifice and survival. A quiet promise that no act of courage should go unanswered. As Alan fastened the final button and turned toward the door, the convoy waited outside, engines idling, headlights slicing through the darkness like beacons. The night stretched out before them, heavy with purpose. Back at the diner, the evening pulsed with the energy of a weekend in full swing. Every table was filled, families sharing stories over slices of pain, teenagers leaning across booths with conspiratorial grins, young couples laughing softly under the warm glow of hanging lights. Plates clattered in the kitchen. The coffee machine hissed, and Kyle wove through the chaos with the ease of someone born for it, his energy boundless. Outside, George remained on the bench, the cool night air brushing his cheeks as he watched the streetlights flicker on, one by one. His thoughts drifted again, not to the diner or the town, but to a distant sea, to the faces of men he'd once called brothers, to a life that felt both impossibly far away and as close as his own heartbeat. He didn't know what the night held, but he felt its weight, as if the stars themselves were watching, waiting for something to unfold. Under the faint glow of the diner's neon sign, George sat on the worn wooden bench, his cane resting lightly across his knees. His weathered hands, marked by time and scars, lay still, and his pale blue eyes gazed into the distance, lost in a sea of memories that seemed to pull him far from the quiet street. The night was calm, save for the occasional hum of a passing car, and George's presence was a familiar one, unassuming, almost invisible to the regulars who shuffled in and out of the diner. To them, he was just the old man who sat there most evenings, a quiet fixture blending into the background of their routine lives. But beneath his stillness, a lifetime of untold stories stirred, heavy with the weight of years long past. Inside the diner, the clatter of plates and the low hum of conversation filled the air. Waiters moved between tables, balancing trays of steaming coffee and plates of greasy fries. Kyle, a young server with a quick grin and a knack for small talk, poured coffee with practiced ease, joking with a couple at the counter. The atmosphere was warm, familiar, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's orders by heart. But then a faint rumble broke through the rhythm of the night. It started as a subtle vibration, barely noticeable, like a tremor beneath the earth. Heads began to lift, forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations trailed off, replaced by a shared, unspoken question. Kyle glanced up, his grin faltering as he followed the gaze of a customer toward the large front window. Outside, headlights sliced through the darkness, their beams stretching long shadows across the empty parking lot. 3 black SUVs rolled into view, their engines purring with a low, deliberate hum. The vehicles moved with an eerie precision, gliding slowly down the street before coming to a smooth stop directly in front of the diner. The sight was jarring, out of place in the sleepy rhythm of the small town. Inside, the diners leaned forward in their booths, their curiosity tinged with unease. A woman at a nearby table clutched her phone, her thumb frozen over the screen. A man in a flannel shirt squinted, his brow creasing as he tried to make sense of the scene unfolding beyond the glass. The SUV doors opened in unison, and 4 figures stepped out onto the pavement. Their movements were sharp, practiced, the soft tap of polished leather shoes echoing faintly in the quiet night. As they emerged into the glow of the streetlights, their silhouettes became unmistakable. 4 Navy officers, their dress blues crisp and immaculate, the faint glint of metals catching the light. The sight sent a ripple of awe and apprehension through the diner. Kyle, still holding the coffee pot, froze mid-pour, his easygoing demeanor replaced by a flicker of confusion. His heart gave a quick thud, and his eyes narrowed as he tried to process what he was seeing. Around him, the room fell silent, the clink of silverware and murmur of voices swallowed by an almost tangible tension. Customers stared, wide-eyed, their phones forgotten in their hands, their breaths held as the officers approached the diner's entrance. The bell above the door let out a sharp jingle as the officers stepped inside, their presence commanding the room in an instant. The soft sound of their polished shoes on the tile floor was the only noise in the hush that followed. Every eye followed them, drawn to the precision of their movements, the weight of their authority. At the front of the group stood Commander James Allen, his posture straight, his face calm but unyielding. His dark eyes swept across the diner, taking in the booths, the tables, the counter, until they settled on Kyle, who stood pale and wide-eyed behind the register. Kyle's throat tightened, his pulse quickening under the intensity of Allen's gaze. He felt exposed, as though the officer could see straight through him, past the apron and the half anything else. Under the dim glow of the diner's neon sign, the cool night air carried a weight of unspoken reverence. George Walker sat on the worn wooden bench outside, his weathered hands clutching a small velvet box, its edges soft from years of quiet safekeeping. His heart thrummed with a rhythm it hadn't known in decades, each beat echoing the overwhelming gratitude and disbelief that swirled within him. Moments ago, a group of Navy officers had approached him, one by one, their faces etched with respect, their hands extended in gratitude. Each handshake, each murmured word of thanks, had stirred something deep in George. A flicker of pride, a warmth that chased away the chill of years spent fading into the background. His pale blue eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, met theirs with a quiet strength, reflecting a man who had carried the weight of sacrifice silently for so long. Now, as the last officer stepped back toward the idling SUVs, their engines humming softly in the distance, George's chest swelled with a fullness he hadn't felt since his days at sea. For the first time in years, a smile broke across his face, not the tired, half-hearted curve of a man resigned to obscurity, but a radiant, grateful grin that spoke of a heart finally seen, a life finally acknowledged. Inside the diner, Kyle stood frozen near the door, his usual cocky demeanor stripped away. His hands twitched nervously at his sides, fingers restless as if searching for something to hold on to. The playful smirk that typically shielded him from the world had vanished, replaced by a raw, dawning awareness that left his face pale and his throat tight. His heart pounded, a frantic rhythm that matched the churning in his mind. He had been so blind, so carelessly dismissive of the old man who sat quietly in the corner, night after night. The realization hit him like a wave, cold and unrelenting, leaving his mouth dry and his thoughts scattered. Before he could stop himself, his legs moved, carrying him through the door, the faint jingle of the bell above barely registering as he stepped into the night. His sneakers scraped awkwardly against the pavement as he jogged toward the bench where George sat, still and composed, the velvet box resting in his trembling hands. "Mr. Walker, sir," Kyle stammered, his voice catching in his throat, each word stumbling over the next. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "I didn't—" His breath hitched, and he faltered, the weight of his ignorance pressing down on him. He looked into George's eyes, those pale blue pools that held a quiet wisdom, and felt a pang of shame twist in his chest. George's face, weathered by time and trials, carried a gentleness that caught Kyle off guard. The old sailor's posture, steady and unyielding despite the years, radiated a strength that made Kyle feel small, not in stature but in understanding. For a long moment, Kyle fidgeted, his fingers knotting together, his head dipping slightly as the guilt gnawed at him. "I shouldn't have," he tried again, but the words crumbled, inadequate and frail. George's gaze softened further, and without a trace of judgment, he reached out, his scarred, trembling hand finding Kyle's shoulder. "It's all right, son," he said, his voice low and warm, carrying the weight of forgiveness Kyle hadn't expected. A tired, kind smile curved George's lips, and in that simple gesture, Kyle felt the air shift, as if the night itself had exhaled. The words, so plain yet so profound, struck Kyle harder than any reprimand could have. His chest tightened, a faint sting prickling at his eyes as he nodded quickly, unable to find his voice. He swallowed hard, the guilt still heavy but somehow lighter under George's steady, forgiving gaze. A few steps away, Miguel leaned against the diner's doorframe, arms crossed casually over his chest, his dark eyes watching the scene with a quiet intensity. A small, knowing smile played at the corners of his mouth, as if he'd seen this moment coming long before Kyle had stumbled into it. He shook his head slightly, pushing off the frame with a fluid motion and walking over to stand beside the young man. "Time to grow up, brother," Miguel murmured, his voice soft but firm, carrying a gentle nudge towards something better, something deeper. He clapped Kyle on the back once, not with judgment, but with encouragement, a quiet call to rise above the boyish arrogance that had defined him until tonight. Kyle let out a shaky breath, his eyes still fixed on George, whose calm presence seemed to anchor the moment, radiating a quiet strength that felt larger than the man himself. For a few heartbeats, the three stood together in the cool night air. George, the old sailor whose sacrifices had finally been seen. Kyle, the young man grappling with his first hard lesson in humility. And Miguel, the cook who had understood the truth all along, his quiet wisdom a steady undercurrent in the diner's rhythm. The night stretched around them, soft and still, the hum of the SUVs fading into the distance. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had shifted, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of the moment. The usual clamor of clinking plates and boisterous chatter had softened into a hushed reverence, a sacred stillness that settled over the room. Customers spoke in low tones, their glances drifting toward the corner table where George now sat, no longer the solitary figure in the shadows, but the honored guest surrounded by four Navy officers. Their uniforms gleamed faintly under the diner's warm lights, and their voices wove together in a tapestry of stories. Some George's own, others from fathers or brothers who had stood beside him on the deck of a burning ship decades ago. Laughter spilled softly from the table, mingling with the clink of coffee cups and the quiet shuffle of plates. George's face, softened by a faint smile, glowed with a warmth that hadn't been there before. His eyes crinkled at the corners as he listened, nodding quietly, his heart swelling with each shared memory, each nod of camaraderie that pulled him back to a time when he was more than just the old man in the corner. Near the counter, Kyle lingered, his elbows propped on the edge, his usual restless energy replaced by a stillness that mirrored the room. His eyes, thoughtful and searching, followed George's every movement, the way the old man's hands moved with a quiet grace as he spoke, the way his laughter came easy now, unguarded. The boyish arrogance that had once defined Kyle seemed to have cracked open, giving way to something humbler, something more awake to the world around him. He watched the officers lean in, hanging on George's words as if each one carried a weight worth hearing. And Kyle felt a shift within himself, a quiet reckoning that this night had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully grasp. Miguel passed behind the counter, his movements deliberate as he refilled a coffee pot, but his eyes flickered toward Kyle with a knowing glance. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. The lesson was unfolding in its own time, and Miguel, with his quiet understanding, knew better than to push. The diner hummed softly, life creeping back to its usual rhythm. But for Kyle, the night was anything but ordinary. It was the night he learned that heroes don't always carry themselves with a swagger, that respect is often owed long before it's given, and that sometimes the quietest figures in the room carry the loudest stories in their hearts. In the warm glow of the diner, Kyle leaned against the counter, his fingers absently tracing the worn edge of the formica. His shift had been long, the kind that made his feet ache and his thoughts blur. But tonight, something felt different. He gave George Walker, seated at his usual corner booth, a gentle pat on the back as he passed by, a gesture born of habit but carrying a new weight. Kyle's mind churned, replaying the evening's revelations, the quiet truths about George he'd only just begun to grasp. The man's weathered hands, the faint scars peeking out from under his rolled-up sleeves, the way he always tipped generously despite his modest order of black coffee and toast. They all told a story Kyle had been too distracted to read until now. A pang of guilt twisted in his chest, mingling with awe. How had he missed it? How had he served this man night after night without seeing the depth behind his unassuming smile? Across the room, Mr. Jenkins, the diner's owner, stood behind the register, his eyes fixed on George with a quiet reverence. His weathered face, lined from years of late nights and early mornings, softened as he watched the old man sip his coffee. Jenkins had known George longer than most, long enough to understand the weight of his silence, the stories he carried but rarely shared. Clearing his throat, Jenkins reached for the microphone that crackled into the kitchen. His voice, steady but warm, carried through the diner. "George Walker's table is on the house tonight." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound, and a soft murmur rippled through the room. Heads turned, eyes widened, and for a moment the clatter of forks and the hum of conversation paused. Near the window, a woman in a red scarf began to clap. Hesitant at first, her hands meeting softly as if testing the room's mood. But the sound caught, spreading like a spark through dry grass. A couple in a nearby booth joined in, their hands coming together with a sincerity that spoke of shared understanding. Teenagers by the door, usually lost in their phones, set them down and added their applause. Their young faces lit with a mix of curiosity and respect. Even the cook, sweat beading on his forehead, stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron before clapping with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The applause wasn't loud or showy, but it was real, a collective gesture that wove every soul in the diner into a fleeting, unspoken bond. It wasn't about obligation or performance, it was gratitude, raw and unfiltered, for a man who had given more than most would ever know. George's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. His smile deepened, etching lines into his weathered cheeks, and he pressed a hand to his chest, the gesture humble yet profound. He shook his head slightly, as if to say he didn't deserve the fuss, but his gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of strangers and regulars alike. In that moment he felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. The weight of his past, the battles he'd fought in distant lands, the losses he'd carried in silence, seemed to lighten, if only for a moment. He lifted his coffee cup, a quiet toast to the room, his hands steady despite the tremor that sometimes betrayed his age. The applause faded and the diner settled back into its familiar rhythm, the clink of glasses, the soft laughter, the sizzle of the grill. But something had shifted. The air felt warmer, heavier with meaning. Kyle watched it all unfold, his heart pounding in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd grown up in this small town, served countless customers in this very diner, but tonight he felt like he was seeing the world through new eyes. George wasn't just the quiet regular who always sat alone. He was a hero, a man whose scars told stories of courage and sacrifice. Kyle's throat tightened as he thought of all the times he'd rushed past George's booth, too caught up in his own worries to notice the man's quiet dignity. He vowed in that moment to be different, to pay attention, to listen, to see the people around him for who they truly were. The realization was both humbling and exhilarating, a spark that promised to change the way he moved through the world. Outside, the night stretched still and peaceful, the stars pinpricks of light against the inky sky. Inside, the diner glowed like a beacon, its warmth spilling out into the darkness. George, now finishing his coffee, felt a quiet contentment settle over him. He'd never sought recognition, never expected it, but tonight's gesture had touched him deeply. It wasn't the free meal or the applause. It was the feeling of being known, of mattering to a room full of people who had once been strangers. For Kyle, the night marked a turning point. As he poured the last cups of coffee and wiped down the counter, he carried a new awareness, a sense that the world was fuller, richer than he'd ever imagined. In a society that often exalts the loudest voices and the most visible triumphs, the quiet heroes like George walk among us, their stories etched not in headlines but in the lines of their faces, the steadiness of their hands. Their scars, physical or otherwise, are not signs of weakness, but badges of lives shaped by selflessness and bravery. It's easy in the rush of modern life to overlook the elderly neighbor who lives alone, the veteran sipping coffee at the corner table, or the stranger carrying burdens from a past we'll never know. But what might happen if we paused, if we looked up, if we took a moment to honor the unsung heroes in our midst? And what of people like Kyle, young and unaware but capable of growth? His journey tonight reminds us that change is always possible, that redemption lies in the willingness to learn, to see, and to act when the moment demands it. The truth that lingered in the diner that night speaks to us still. True strength is often quiet, and the greatest heroes are those who ask for nothing in return.